You need to disappear for a while. And before you decide that doesn't apply to you, before you mentally categorize this as advice for someone else, someone more burned out, someone more obviously struggling, someone whose life looks more visibly like it needs a pause than yours currently does, I want you to sit with something for just a moment. Think about the last time you were completely alone with yourself. Not alone in the same room as your phone. Not alone in the car with music filling every available second of silence. Not alone in the technical sense of nobody else being physically present while your mind is still entirely occupied with other people, their needs, their opinions, their expectations, their versions of you, their ongoing narratives about who you are and what you owe them, and what kind of person you're being based on the most recent decisions you've made. I mean, genuinely, completely, uncomplicatedly, alone with yourself, with your own thoughts moving at their own pace without being constantly interrupted by the noise of a life that has been arranged almost entirely around other people's access to you. If you are struggling to remember the last time that happened, if the honest answer is that you genuinely cannot identify a recent moment that fits that description, then this episode is not for someone else. This episode is for you. And what I'm about to tell you about why you need to disappear, what disappearing actually means at the psychological level, and what is waiting for you in the silence that most people spend enormous energy avoiding, might be the most important conversation you have this year. So stay. Ironically, you need to stay right here for a little while so I can tell you why you need to go. Let's start with what disappearing is not, because the word carries connotations that immediately activate resistance in the people who most need to hear this message. Disappearing is not abandonment. It is not irresponsibility. It is not the self-indulgent retreat of someone who can't handle the demands of a real life, which is the specific framing that keeps the most depleted, most overextended, most genuinely exhausted people from ever giving themselves permission to stop. Because that framing, the idea that needing to withdraw, needing to step back, needing to create distance between yourself and the constant demands of your life, is a character weakness rather than a biological necessity, is not wisdom. It is conditioning. It is the voice of every system, every relationship, every cultural message that has ever benefited from your continuous availability and learned, early and thoroughly, that the most effective way to maintain that availability is to make you feel guilty for wanting anything different. Disappearing, in the sense I am using it, is not running away from your life. It is running toward yourself. It is the deliberate, conscious, psychologically necessary act of creating enough space between who you are and everything that has been layered on top of who you are. The roles, the responsibilities, the relationships, the identities constructed for other people's comfort. To finally, clearly, see the difference between the two. And that difference, once seen, changes everything. Which is exactly why so many people are unconsciously, relentlessly, expertly busy in ways that make seeing it impossible. Here is what psychology actually tells us about what happens to a human being who never disappears. And I want to be precise here, because the research on this is not soft or ambiguous, or the kind of finding that can be dismissed as applicable only to extreme cases. Studies in social psychology and cognitive neuroscience consistently show that continuous social engagement, the kind of always on, always available, always reachable existence that most people in modern life have normalized to the point of not even questioning it, produces measurable deterioration in several specific capacities that are absolutely fundamental to living a psychologically healthy life. Self-referential processing, which is the brain's ability to accurately assess its own states, preferences, and needs, degrades under conditions of continuous social demand. Identity coherence, which is the sense of having a stable, continuous self that persists across different contexts and relationships, weakens when a person is perpetually adapting themselves to the requirements of different social environments without sufficient time between adaptations to return to a baseline. Emotional regulation, which is the capacity to manage your own internal states rather than being managed by them, becomes increasingly compromised when the nervous system never has undemanded time to complete its own regulatory cycles. In plain language, if you never disappear, you literally lose the ability to know who you are, what you actually feel, and how to manage yourself from the inside, rather than being managed by everything outside. You don't just get tired, you get lost. And the particular cruelty of getting lost this way is that it happens so gradually, and the environment around you is so consistent in its demands that most people don't recognize the lostness until they are so far from themselves that finding their way back requires something much more dramatic than a good night's sleep. Now here's where it gets specifically relevant to the people who are most likely listening to this: the empaths, the overgivers, the people whose identity has been so thoroughly organized around being available to others that the concept of disappearing feels not just uncomfortable, but almost structurally impossible. Because for this particular kind of person, the barriers to disappearing are not just external, not just the actual demands and actual responsibilities and actual people who actually need things. They are internal. They are the deeply conditioned belief, running so far below the level of conscious thought that it rarely gets examined, that their worth is proportional to their presence, that being needed is the same as being loved, that the moment they step back, the moment they create any meaningful distance between themselves and the people and situations that depend on them, something irreplaceable will be lost, not just by the people they step back from, but by themselves. Because if they are not the one who stays, who absorbs, who shows up regardless of cost, who are they? That question, sitting underneath all the busyness and all the giving and all the exhaustion that looks from the outside like dedication, but feels from the inside like drowning. That question is the real reason they cannot disappear. Not the logistics, not the actual demands on their time. The terror of what they might find, or fail to find, in the silence that the disappearing creates. And here is the psychological truth about that terror that most people who study this talk around rather than directly into. The terror is not irrational. It is based on something real, something that was probably confirmed at some point early enough and clearly enough that it lodged itself in the nervous system as a foundational operating principle. At some point in her history, the person who cannot disappear learned that her presence was more valued than her person, that what she did mattered more than who she was, that the love available to her was conditional in a specific way, conditional on her usefulness, her availability, her willingness to orient herself entirely toward other people's needs and away from her own. And a child or a young person, or even an adult early in a formative relationship, who learns that lesson does not simply note it intellectually and move on. They build their entire relational architecture around it. They become someone for whom disappearing feels genuinely dangerous, because disappearing, in the original context, where the lesson was learned, had consequences. Being unavailable had costs. Taking up space with your own needs, rather than attending to someone else's, was the kind of thing that produced withdrawal, disappointment, punishment, the particular cold distance of someone who needed you to be a certain way and was not equipped to care for you when you were something else. So she learned. She became available. She became indispensable. She became the person who never disappeared, because disappearing was the thing that made love conditional on her return. And she could not afford for love to be that conditional. Not when she was small, not when she needed it too much to risk losing it. And now she is not small anymore. and she does not need it from those specific people anymore. And the conditions that created the terror have long since changed. But the terror stayed. Because terror of that particular quality, learned that early, does not update automatically when circumstances change. It requires something more intentional than time to release it. What it requires, specifically, is exactly what it has always been most afraid of. It requires her to disappear. To find out, in the actual lived experience of being alone with herself, rather than in the theoretical consideration of it, that what she feared would be there is not what is actually there. That the silence is not the abandonment she learned to associate with it. That being unavailable to others does not make her unavailable to herself. That the absence of demands does not produce the emptiness she braced for, but something she has no prior experience with, and therefore no adequate name for yet. Something that arrives in the first real quiet she has allowed herself in longer than she can clearly remember. Something that moves through the space where the obligation used to live. Something that Goleman, and every serious researcher of human consciousness who has ever studied what happens when people finally stop, has described with variations of the same word. And that word, and what it means specifically for the person who has been running from it, and what becomes possible in the life of someone who finally stops running long enough to let it arrive, that is exactly where we are going next. That word is stillness. And I know how that lands. I know that for a significant number of people hearing it, stillness sounds like the least interesting, least urgent, least relevant answer to a setup that promised something more revelatory. Stillness sounds passive. Stillness sounds like the absence of things rather than the presence of anything. Stillness sounds, if we're being honest, a little like nothing. And nothing is precisely what the person who has been running from the silence is most afraid of finding there. But here is what Goleman's research and decades of psychological study on solitude, recovery, and identity reconstruction consistently reveal about stillness when it is genuinely accessed, rather than simply described. It is not nothing. It is the exact opposite of nothing. It is the condition under which everything that has been buried under the noise of a continuously demanded life begins, slowly and without fanfare, to surface. And what surfaces is not darkness, not the emptiness that was feared, not the identity crisis that was braced for. It is the self, the actual, unperformed, unadapted, unborrowed self that has been there the entire time, underneath every role and every responsibility, and every version of herself she has been presenting to every different person in every different context of her life. The self that never disappeared, even when she was busy disappearing into everyone else. The self that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for exactly this, the moment she finally gets quiet enough to hear it. The research on what happens to people when they give themselves genuine solitude, not the accidental solitude of a canceled plan or a quiet afternoon, but intentional, committed, meaningful withdrawal from the continuous demands of social life, is some of the most consistently striking in all of social psychology. Studies consistently show that people who engage in deliberate solitude report not the loneliness or the discomfort they anticipated, but something that surprises them in its quality and its depth. They report a return of preferences they had forgotten they had, opinions that had been gradually eroded by the constant negotiation of living in close, continuous proximity to other people's opinions about everything, including who they should be and how they should feel and what should matter to them. They report the return of a kind of internal clarity that feels familiar in the way that things feel familiar when you encounter them again after a long absence, not new, but recognized. Like coming back to something that was always yours and finding it exactly where you left it, waiting without resentment, ready to be inhabited again the moment you arrived. And they report something that almost no one predicted going in and almost everyone names coming out. a quality of rest so deep and so different from the ordinary tiredness of sleep that it requires a different word. Not recovered, restored. The distinction matters because recovery implies returning to the baseline that preceded the exhaustion. Restoration implies returning to something further back than that, to the version of the self that existed before the exhaustion became the baseline. Before the running became so constant that the running felt like standing still. Now let's talk about what disappearing actually looks like in practical terms. Because this conversation has to land somewhere real, or it becomes another piece of content that moves something in you and then evaporates when you put your phone down and the demands of your life immediately reassert themselves. Disappearing does not require a retreat center in the mountains, though if that is available to you, it is not an unwelcome option. It does not require weeks of absence, or a dramatic restructuring of your external life, or the kind of grand gesture that makes a compelling before and after story. What it requires is something considerably more achievable and considerably more frightening, because its simplicity removes every logistical excuse that was making it easy to postpone. It requires you to create, deliberately and consistently, and with the same commitment you have always given to every external demand on your time. Unstructured time that belongs entirely to you. Not productive time. Not self-improvement time. Not time that is quietly oriented toward becoming a better version of yourself for other people's eventual benefit. Time that has no agenda beyond your own presence within it. Time that is not filled with podcasts or music or scrolling or any of the thousand small inputs that the modern nervous system has learned to reach for automatically the moment silence begins to feel like something that needs to be solved. Time in which the only thing required of you is that you remain inside your own experience long enough to find out what that experience actually is, when it is not being continuously shaped by everyone else's proximity to it. This is harder than it sounds. Not logistically. Logistically, most people can find 30 minutes in a day if they are honest about where 30 minutes currently goes. It is harder than it sounds because the nervous system that has been conditioned to continuous social engagement does not immediately settle into stillness when stillness is offered. It resists. It reaches. It generates a low-grade restlessness that feels very much like boredom, but is actually something more specific. It is the withdrawal response of a system that has been running on external stimulation for so long that the absence of that stimulation registers initially as something missing rather than something gained. The first few times you disappear, the first few times you sit in genuine silence without filling it, without giving it a purpose, without orienting it toward any outcome other than your own presence within it, will likely not feel peaceful. They will likely feel uncomfortable in a way that makes you want to reach for your phone, make a call, find something to do that converts the unstructured time back into structured time, where you know what your role is and what is expected of you. This discomfort is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. It is a sign that you are doing it for the first time. And the difference between the people who push through that initial discomfort into the stillness waiting on the other side of it, and the people who retreat back into the noise every time the discomfort arrives, is not a difference in strength or discipline or psychological health. It is a difference in whether they have been told, clearly enough and by someone they trust enough, that what is on the other side is worth the discomfort of getting there. So I am telling you now, it is worth it. Not because the stillness is comfortable, it isn't, not at first, not entirely even later, but because what you find in it is irreplaceable, and what you lose by continuing to avoid it is something you cannot afford to keep losing. What you lose by continuing to avoid it is the thread back to yourself that every period of genuine solitude strengthens, and every period of continuous external demand gradually frays. And the thread matters not just for your own internal experience, not just for the quality of your relationship with yourself, but for the quality of everything you bring to every relationship with anyone else. Because here is the thing that the people who feel guilty about disappearing, who worry that stepping back is a betrayal of the people who need them, most need to understand. The version of you that never disappears is not the most available version of you. It is the most depleted version. It is the version that shows up to every relationship running on reserves that were exhausted some time ago, giving from a place that is performing generosity rather than genuinely feeling it, present in the technical sense of being physically located in the vicinity of the people who need her, while being functionally absent in the sense that actually matters, the sense of being truly, fully, completely there. The version of you that disappears regularly, that returns to herself with enough consistency that the thread never frays beyond repair, that fills from the inside before pouring outward, that version has something to actually give. Something that is genuinely there when she extends it, rather than something that was never quite there, but was offered anyway, because the alternative felt too selfish to tolerate. Real presence. The kind of presence that actually serves the people you love, that actually holds the weight of what the people in your life need from you, is only available from a person who has enough of herself left to be present with. And enough of herself left requires that she regularly, unapologetically, without guilt and without the need for external permission, disappears. So here is what I am actually asking you to do, as specifically and as honestly as I can ask it. Not to abandon your life, not to retreat from your relationships, not to make a dramatic exit from everything that needs you and build something entirely new from a place of isolation. I am asking you to find the silence, to stop filling every available moment with input, to sit with yourself long enough and often enough that the self you sit with starts to feel familiar again. Familiar the way home feels familiar, the way your own name feels familiar, the way the things that are most genuinely yours feel familiar when you return to them after too long away. I am asking you to disappear, not from your life, but into it, into the actual, specific, irreplaceable life that is yours, rather than the performance of a life assembled from everyone else's needs and expectations and versions of who you should be. That life, the real one, the one that has been waiting in the quiet for as long as you have been running from the quiet, it is still there. It has always been there. And the moment you stop long enough to find it, the moment you disappear from everything that has been drowning it out long enough to finally, clearly, hear it, that moment will not feel like disappearing at all.